Morning, Ryan.
Morning, Addy.
Thank you for joining me on a sunny morning here at the Strand. Back to where it potentially started. We're going to have a conversation about that, about policy, public services, implementing policies locally in Merseyside, where you're from.
Brilliant.
All that kind of stuff. So first of all, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Ryan Wayne. I'm Executive Director of the Tony Blair Institute, but I think I've got a licence to say this, given you've mentioned Merseyside. I am a Scouser first and foremost, so I found this niche in life where I'm straddling the gap between what's happening in Westminster and how policy's made and how it's shaping the country, and also what's happening up in Merseyside, a place I care deeply about, and I'm interested in how you marry the two, because I don't think Westminster can serve places like Merseyside. I think there needs to be change on that front.
And that's what I'm really interested to talk to you about, because actually most of my conversations are with people from where I've lived and been, raised all my life, East London. And I'm also interested about how national stuff affects local stuff. And you two are also grappling with that.
Absolutely.
What are the key things that you're focused on in terms of translating that kind of national conversation to local dynamics?
I think for me, we can so often, when we look at what's happening locally, get caught up in structures, and I think this has dominated the devolution debate. And often when we have a conversation along these lines of how do you empower a region or how do you improve things at a local level outside of Westminster, we do quickly get to structures, and the debate is so much about devolution. But I think that can miss a trick, in the sense that a lot of the policy levers, whether we like it or not, still do lie in Westminster. And of course, we should always be fighting for decisions to be made closer to the people they affect. But simply there are decisions that is just not going to be the case with. And so what I think we need to do is focus much more on insight. And I think there's a real role here for local leaders. And we're talking elected leaders, MPs, councillors, regional mayors, making sure that they are churning up that insight to really understand an area, understand what it needs, what it wants from a particular policy position. And then it's not just elected leaders, it can also be community champions, local representatives. And I think we need to do more to empower and embolden those people. But once you have insight and that is feeding into the policy making decisions, I think as well we need to really value and champion pilots and taking a few risks. I think Britain is dominated by a risk averseness. I think, to be honest, it's a democracy problem. I think democracy of late has an efficacy challenge. It's not able to get stuff done. And yet, I know Merseyside. I know the social entrepreneurs in Merseyside. I know some of the exciting initiatives taking place across that region, Knowsley and Bootle. Brilliant people doing brilliant things. People are willing to take risks and willing to try stuff. And I think that is the real offer and opportunity, actually, for that bridging that gap between what's taking place in Westminster and what's happening at a local level. And I'll give one example, and there are many, but I can give one example. You look at something like healthcare in this country. So when you look at healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP, it's only going in one direction. And with a country that is struggling to get out of 0.1, 0.2% growth, that can only mean one thing. You either give poor quality healthcare because you're not funding it. You either cut services elsewhere or you increase taxes, and that's unsustainable. And so I know you've been very active in this space and you've contributed some great thinking to it. The health policy in this country and across all the Western world more generally needs to shift to a much more preventative model. And it's one of those things that we all say and we all agree on. And when you look at what that actually means in practice, it's essentially things like data, making better use of patient data at an individual level, really empowering us so that we can understand what we're susceptible to from a health perspective, what treatments might work for us, what treatments might not, but also being able to navigate our appointments, our patient records, things that we get frustrated about on a daily basis, at that individual level. But then the really exciting thing, this is where the regional stuff comes into play and where we need to pilot some stuff and take a few risks, is that cross-population data. So when you get a whole cohort of folk together, whether they're from a particular area or a particular demographic, and you start to see whether there's commonalities in terms of the illnesses and diseases they may be susceptible to, or even how treatments are working, whether there's commonalities when illnesses occur, in what situations. It's all data points that we probably collect anyway, but we don't collate. The insight that can provide is immense, and I would love to be in a position where someone like Merseyside, which has some of the worst health outcomes in the country, we're talking health disparities of 10, 20, 30 years with some of the richest places in London. And also, I know that where you're from in East London, it's actually the same story, which is shocking, because
very shocking, yeah.
It's we're talking like miles apart here. But I'd love a place like Merseyside to really stand up and say, not only are we going to give insight in terms of building formulating our health policy in Britain, but we're also going to put our hand up and say, we are going to pilot this. Like, we want to be the first movers on this. Let's take a risk. Let's implement this policy. Let's shift Merseyside healthcare to a truly preventative model that prizes itself on keeping people out of hospital, and we start to see the results go up and up and up. And guess what? Not only does that then work for the people of Merseyside, but we also see insight and a pilot that can work for...
Can we speak to some of the mindset shifts that might need to happen for that to work? And if we just explain why we're here, so you do some work with the Policy Institute here at King's. I'm a current PhD student here, and you're also, I think, president of the student union.
That's right.
One time. So with policy makers at the moment being more risk, taking more risk, what kind of mindset shift do you think needs to happen for that to happen? Do you think there needs to be more education and training, or something else needs to be different for then that to be true, that we are, being more innovative and creative with policy making?
I think it starts and ends with people and the people in policy making positions. And I look at Westminster and I don't feel particularly inspired by what's coming out of it. I think the last few years have just been dominated by politics, and I think understandably so. Politics has then been met with politics, and you end up with this very introspective debate. Whereas what we need to do is create a space to have a conversation about the future of the country, and we need people in politics to participate in that conversation. Now, the great news is, across both sides of the political division, political traditions in Britain, there are politicians who want to actively participate in that. So what I've tried to do in my day job at the Turnbull Institute is create that space. We've launched something called The Future of Britain. But you need people to turn up to that and want to actively participate and want to actively listen to and hear and interrogate experience and expertise, but also leave that room knowing that it's on them and feeling inspired and proud that it's on them to start to drive the country forward. And it's a really, really difficult thing to do. So we need the people in politics across all levels to see this as their mission and want to drive it forward. And when politics is presenting itself and there's an easy political win to be made, or there's a political debate to get involved with that may get you clicks and likes and retweets, maybe it's about being a bit brave and saying, do you know what, that is the short term. I'm going to sweep that to one side and look forward. And alongside that, I do think there needs to be a parallel track. We talk so much about policy, we talk so much about how we do politics in this country and the things that need to change on that front. And they're well documented, and it's a systemic issue, and there's some brilliant people in the system. But I think we also need to get some new folk into the system as well. So this is where it starts and ends with people, because it's about people in politics. And those of you watching this, and yourself as well, actually, I would implore you to get more actively involved in politics. I've seen so much written recently about how people are hesitant to say they want to go into politics, or even that people are, smart people are actively against it because it's not a desirable career. I think public service is such a noble thing, and it's right that we try and get the brightest and the best from across the country, including back home in Merseyside, some brilliant people who should be in politics. And I think it's on us, those of us who are actively engaged, to try and encourage that and make it happen.
I agree with you 100%. As someone who's been in public service pretty much all my professional life, 15 years experience in the NHS, 2 years now as a civil servant. I would implore people, I would second that message. Shifting gears a little bit now from public service to public services.
Yep.
Could you speak a little bit to how policy can transform public services? Because I think that's something you're interested in.
Yeah, I think it goes back to this. I think where we're a little bit stuck at the moment is the role of the state, and I think the state as is still a product of the 20th century, post-industrial revolution. The debate on public services is stuck between, do we use the private sector or is it publicly owned? And I think it needs to be much more than that. I think first of all we need to start with citizens of our people and understand what they want and need from public services, and then start to look at how they interact with services elsewhere in their life. And I come back to this idea of data, because I really do think with the right policy we can start to not just reform public services or make gradual changes, but actually transform them in a way that your viewers will resonate with. Because how we interact with services outside the government is very different to how we interact with services provided by government. And I think that imbalance needs to be addressed. And policy can play a role in terms of forcing that innovation, but I also think we've got to be careful that we don't end up in a trap where innovation in public services requires the government to come on down on high every couple of years and say, you need to innovate here, you need to innovate there. Innovation needs to be baked in to the system. And so I think the way of looking at the role that policy can play in this is what I would call the enablers, the policy enablers. I think digital identity, for example, is something which is very interesting in the sense that we empower citizens to really own and control their data. And this is data, by the way, that we're given to government all the time. So it's not like a big brother thing. In fact, I think we need to make sure that it's properly secure and that security is enhanced and privacy is protected. But I'm talking about things like your health records, your ability to make appointments with the NHS, your ability to interact with the NHS, but also your education, attainment records, and how you learn. So when you go into school, we're used to filling in exercise books, doing exams at the end of the year. I think something like a digital ID would allow you to log onto a system, work with a teacher to answer questions, to study, and all of that data, the same data that you give away to private companies on the internet all the time, all that data is collected, and it builds up a real picture of you, how you learn. And then with that enabler, you start to then get excited about things like AI, because we could be in a position where every kid in Britain has a personal AI tutor that complements the role of the teacher in a classroom. And we can definitely be in a position where the digitalisation of public services, things like a digital ID, mean that teachers aren't spending their evenings marking textbooks or essentially manual data collection. And that for me is the perfect encapsulation actually of the difference between what we understand of reform of public services and transformation of public services. And I don't think this is necessarily strictly a cost-cutting exercise either. I don't think it should be. I think genuinely the objective here, the policy objective, needs to be, how do we have the best education in this country that makes the use of technology? How do you have the best healthcare that makes the best use of technology? And also, how do we avoid what happened in the 80s when there was mass deregulation, embrace of the free market, and a lot of people left behind? Policy's got a role to play there in order to make sure that there's a backstop to that. So enablers.
If I could, just because I see a lot of the benefits in that,
Sure.
Amazing benefits. What would you say to the detractors who would suggest that AI and machine learning could identify points where there is need for intervention? So it could assess millions of kids and analyse that if certain things are happening, then it's more likely this bad thing is happening, and so you need to make an intervention to prevent grades further slipping. But under the wrong administration, a government could also use trends to make other assumptions that actually what's happening in this person's life isn't what we would like from their own political moral lens, and so then they would make an intervention that other people would agree with. How do you protect all of that stuff not kind of going down the wrong path?
Well, there's a short technical answer to that, and then there's a political answer. The technical answer is that you decentralise that data and you have laws in place that make sure it's protected, and the data itself doesn't sit in one place, because I think that is when it is susceptible to that. But the political answer is that we do live in a democracy, and we should be proud of that. And look, politics and government has not covered itself in glory in recent years, but I think we have the opportunity to elect a government, and also to get rid of a government that we think is abusing its power and privilege. That we don't live in an autocracy, and so we have transparency mechanisms in place, we have accountability mechanisms in place, both at national level, regional level, local level, that I think go some way to mitigating against that. But I think, going back to what we were talking about before, this fear, I understand it, I really do, but I do think it gets in the way of actually making things happen. We need regulation, we need to protect people's privacy. That comes first and foremost in my view, but we can't let that get in the way of what I think is a country that is actually facing decline.
And when you think about it from a global competitive point of view, I imagine other countries not being far from embracing these kind of technologies, and we may get into a position, if we're not careful, where our kids are lagging behind in terms of attainment with other kids from other countries.
Yeah, exactly.
And that has all kind of consequences for productivity, growth, and things that this country
and
can
investment
achieve.
in this country. There's a reason why Elon Musk is speaking to Macron in France, where they've got a science and technology agenda and academy. There's a skill set that is going to start to feed the jobs of the future. It's happening in pockets here, but we need to be much more conscious of it and much more coordinated to it as well.
Yeah. We're going to start wrapping up in a minute, because I know we've got other stuff to crack on with. You're incredibly passionate about public services, policy, transforming public services, and policy and politics. And you were, head of the President Union here. Just speak to where that passion came from, and kind of, where were you first politically active, and what kind of inspired you to pursue policy as a thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. Still trying to work it out. One of my earliest memories, do you remember the Liverpool Dockers strikes?
Yeah.
Robbie Fowler wearing the T-shirt. So my dad used to take me to the picket lines, and I just remember feeling like a sense of, I think the word that we'd use in labour circles now is solidarity, but that definitely wasn't the word that we were using at the time. And I don't know, I've just always had this, and I think you've got it as well, like this sort of burning desire to make change, and also feel like I've got a role to play in that change. And the thing that I've been reflecting on over recent years is that growing up, working class lad in Liverpool, my mum was receptionist in Knowsley, my dad worked in Fortune Halewood. It wasn't a particularly big political family, small political family. So there was that, but one of the things that never really happened, and it's true for 99.9% of the population, is I never really thought myself as a leader growing up. In fact, the thing that you wanted to do as a kid in Liverpool in the noughties was just blend in. Like, you didn't want to stand out. And I also never really gave myself permission to think about the changes that I wanted to see. But I had that small p politics. And I think it's a small p politics that just made me make a series of decisions, including wanting to come to London to study. That was really important to me. Everyone was telling me, don't do it, really expensive. And then my mum was just looking at every article was like, don't send your kid to London. It is just, if you want to break even after uni, don't do it. And I got into serious debt and stuff like that. But it was a really good decision.
Facts, yeah.
Because it put me in the heart of where power rests and lies, whether we like it or not. And I don't like it, but it's the truth. And you have to take the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. So I found myself in this, with this small p politics, and actually, for the first time in my life, standing out. And I just started to, over time, to a bit of reconciliation, I started to embrace that. And then I did allow myself to start thinking about what is wrong with this country, what are the things that I want to change, or what is my vision for it, what are the things that are different, what are the things that are different for me that I think should be different back at home in Merseyside, in Liverpool. And by the way, that permission to think about the country or think about your values and your vision, it's the stuff that's on the curriculum at Harrow and Eton. And it's of late, I really began to reflect on that, and I feel something. And so you're right to identify coming together of different things. I'm an expert in none of these things. I'm not an expert in politics or policy or communication, but I feel like I've got this neat combination of all three that lends itself quite well to where we're at as a country and where we need to go next, and how our politics needs to change in order to unlock some of those policies that I've had the good fortune of being able to interact with and understand.
Yeah, well, for all the many years that I've known and seen you, it's so exciting to think about what might come next. As you, on your personal leadership journey, talk more with, political academics and political stakeholders, civil servants, talking about the future of Britain and what's next for where you've, come from, where you've lived, where you've been raised in Merseyside. So yeah, it's interesting. So thanks for this time.
Thank you, mate. Really
look forward to
appreciate
what's next for you.
Nice one.
Cheers
Man.